Hey there, dreamers. Welcome to Snoozy Tour, where history slows down enough for you to fall asleep inside it. Here we don't shout facts, we whisper stories. The kind that drift through time, carrying the scent of fire, dust, and maybe something else tonight. Because tonight's journey isn't about kings or conquerors. It's about a plant, one small, stubborn leaf that's outlived them all. A plant that healed emperors, calmed philosophers, fueled rebellions, and confused governments for 5,000 years. Some called it medicine, others called it sin. But no matter how hard the world tried to banish it, it always found a way to grow back. So before we wander into the smoke-filled corners of history, take a deep breath, dim the lights, and maybe let the hum of your fan be the rhythm of the past calling you home. You're listening to Snoozy Tour, where every story starts softly, and somewhere between fact and dream, you might just find yourself falling asleep. To the oldest love-hate story humanity ever planted. Imagine the world before cities, before writing, before even the idea of tomorrow. You're standing in the chill of a Stone Age night somewhere on the Siberian plains. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and raw earth. Civilization hasn't been invented yet. Humanity is still testing the beta version of survival. A forager crouches beside a small fire, tossing dried plants onto the coals for warmth. Among them, a few sprigs of something wiry and unfamiliar. The smoke curls upward, sweet and oddly heavy. The people lean closer, curious. One of them inhales, coughs, laughs, and suddenly forgets why they came outside in the first place. That's it. No grand discovery, no ceremony, just the universe playing a quiet joke. The first accidental high. Archaeologists thousands of years later would find the traces. Hemp seeds buried with bodies, fibers twisted into ropes, ashes mixed with bone dust. A clue that this humble plant wasn't just useful, it was meaningful. People carried it with them into death. And you have to ask yourself, why? Was it sacred? Or was it just humanity's first recorded case of not wanting to leave their stash behind? Early humans didn't call it cannabis, of course. They called it nothing at all. It was simply there. A wild, green miracle that fed them, clothed them, and later entertained them. Its fibers made rope strong enough to drag mammoth bones. Its seeds roasted well on stone, full of oil and protein. And somewhere along the way, someone realized that burning it made the night a little funnier, the stars a little friendlier, and the cold slightly less unbearable. You could sail with it, tie with it, wear it, eat it, and, if you were lucky, see the gods through it. Cannabis was nature's first multi-tool, and humanity, ever ambitious, quickly fell in love. But here's where the story turns from survival to something stranger. The tribes that used hemp for rope began using its smoke for ritual. They saw visions in the haze, ancestors, spirits, or maybe just the first hallucinations mistaken for holiness. Fire became not only warmth but revelation. Smoke wasn't random, it was breath from another world. Can you picture it? A circle of hunters staring into the fire as the air thickens, their hearts slowing, their minds opening to shapes in the dark. Would you have been afraid of that feeling, or fascinated? Would you have thought the gods were punishing you, or letting you borrow their sight for a moment? Somewhere in that fragile space between fear and wonder, humanity took its first spiritual hit. What's astonishing is that this tiny moment, the laugh around a campfire, the seed in a grave, would outlive empires. It would cross mountains, deserts, oceans. It would become medicine, contraband, philosophy, and poetry. It would comfort the dying, amuse the bored, inspire musicians, and terrify governments. But right now, here in the dark, it's just smoke curling above a fire. Think about it. Every revolution starts small. Every addiction too. Which do you think this was? The night deepens. The foragers drift into sleep. Some smiling, some dreaming of stars that whisper. They don't know it yet, but they've just lit the first spark of a 7,000-year conversation between humanity and a plant clever enough to make us cultivate it, worship it, outlaw it, and come crawling back again. So before there were philosophers, before there were priests, there was cannabis and curiosity. The oldest partnership in history began not with science or sin, but with a question we still haven't answered. What happens when you inhale a little mystery? Fast forward a couple of millennia. Civilization has stopped guessing how fire works and started writing things down about it. In the valleys of ancient China, people are inventing paper, bureaucracy, and long work hours. They've domesticated the ox, perfected the plow, and built a culture that runs on balance, yin and yang, heaven and earth, duty and desire. And in the middle of it all stands a man half legend, half scientist. Emperor Shennong, the divine farmer. Picture him. Long robes of green and gold, skin bronzed by the sun, eyes sharp as flint. He's not your typical emperor. He's a tinkerer, an experimenter, the kind of ruler who personally taste tests new plants to see whether they heal or kill. Imagine that job. Every lunch could be your last. According to legend, Shennong sampled hundreds of herbs, cataloging their effects. Ginseng, tea, ephedra, all born from his curiosity. But one plant, tall and slender with serrated leaves and an earthy aroma, caught his attention. He called it Ma, the plant of balance. The rest of the world would later call it cannabis. Shennong brewed its leaves into teas, crushed its seeds into powders, and wrote that it calms the spirit and nourishes the body. He even prescribed it for pain, rheumatism, and, somewhat ironically, forgetfulness. It was medicine before chemistry, therapy before psychology, and arguably humanity's first prescription for peace. But here's the irony: the divine farmer never explained what peace felt like. Was it relief from pain, or the quiet drifting of a softened mind? Would you have trusted him if he handed you a steaming cup and said, "Drink, you will forget your suffering, and maybe everything else"? Cannabis in Shennong's China wasn't rebellious or forbidden. It was respectable, medical, and even divine. Doctors used it to ease fever. Priests used it to still the mind. To a culture obsessed with balance, this plant seemed to whisper, "Let go." And yet, even the most disciplined society can't resist curiosity. Can you imagine one of those early scholars, robes billowing, quietly inhaling a bit too much of that smoke and thinking, "So this is what heaven feels like"? Did they tell anyone or keep the secret to themselves like a sacred sin? By now, hemp was everywhere. Fields of it rolled across the countryside like green oceans. The same plant that soothed pain also clothed the people, filled their lamps with oil, and gave scribes the paper to record their thoughts. Entire villages lived surrounded by cannabis, in their clothes, their ropes, their scrolls. There was a civilization literally written on weed. And think about that, if the world's earliest ideas about medicine, order, and philosophy were written on hemp paper, does that mean cannabis helped shape civilization itself? Maybe the plant didn't just heal bodies. Maybe it healed the chaos of early human thought. Still, there's something almost comic about it. While Taoist mystics were burning incense to glimpse eternity, somewhere in a farmer's hut, someone was just trying to stop their back from hurting. Same plant, different purpose. In Shennong's pen Tsao Ching, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, cannabis is described as good for hundreds of ailments. Hundreds. Not one miracle cure, but a universal balm for life's suffering. If you lived in an age of famine, fever, and spear wounds, wouldn't you have believed in miracles too? What's more, the Chinese didn't see this plant as sinful. They didn't associate it with moral failure or rebellion. It was simply another piece of the natural world, part of the divine pattern. They believed harmony wasn't found by fighting nature but by understanding it. And maybe that's why they saw cannabis differently than we do today. Not as an escape, but as an alignment. Would you have drunk that bitter tea if it promised a little balance in a world of constant struggle? Would you have believed it was the gods whispering through the leaves? Or just nature helping you breathe easier for a while? In the cool stillness of ancient China, under a moon reflected in a pot of boiling herbs, the divine farmer leaned over his steaming cup and took a sip. The world slowed, the noise softened, the pain faded. And perhaps, just for a moment, humanity understood something profound. That peace doesn't always roar, sometimes it exhales. The world has grown busier now. Bronze gleams on blades. Horses thunder across the steppes. And somewhere between the Caspian Sea and the Altai Mountains, a group of nomads decides that funerals are too quiet. They are the Scythians, warriors, riders, traders, and occasional mystics. Their lives move with the herds, their homes are tents, and their faith is as wide as the sky. For them, death isn't an ending, it's a doorway. And that doorway, as it turns out, opens best through smoke. When a great warrior dies, his companions build a circular tent of animal hides. Inside, they lay stones over a pit of burning coals. Then they throw hemp seeds onto the heat. Instantly, the air thickens. Not incense, not firewood, but a scent sharp, sweet, alive. The tent fills with shimmering clouds and the Scythians step inside. Herodotus, the Greek historian, would later write that they howled with pleasure. That was the polite Greek way of saying they got very, very high. Can you picture it? 20 warriors crouched in that dim tent, their furs damp with sweat, tattoos glistening, eyes half closed. The drums outside slow down. The smoke swirls. Would you have followed them in, to mourn a friend, or to see what waited beyond breath? Would you have believed the spirits truly stood among you in that haze? To the Scythians, this wasn't entertainment. It was communion. The smoke wasn't escape. It was a bridge. They said it carried the soul to the other side, that it eased the grief of the living and the journey of the dead. In their world, even sorrow had ceremony, and cannabis was its sacred tool. Archaeologists have found the proof. Golden bowls buried beside chiefs, still dusted with traces of cannabis resin. Imagine that, gold bongs 3,000 years old. The kind of devotion you don't fake. You don't take your favorite herb into the grave unless you think you'll need it there. Why do you think people have always mixed smoke with spirit? Is it the way it vanishes, here one moment, gone the next, that makes it feel like the soul? Or maybe it's simpler. Maybe humans just like the way the world softens when it drifts around them. What's certain is this: the Scythians didn't care what anyone thought. They lived hard, died young, and laughed at death in a cloud of aromatic defiance. Where other cultures built temples of stone, the Scythians built temples of air. And their idea spread. Persian traders saw the rituals and carried them west. Greek travelers tried to explain them, half fascinated, half scandalized. Even in faraway India, priests began to blend smoke and faith. The Scythians had turned grief into transcendence, and the world was taking notes. Think about it. This plant, once just food and fiber, was now something cosmic. It had become part of the human vocabulary for meaning. When words failed, people burned it. When pain grew too deep, they breathed it. And when life ended, they trusted the smoke to speak for them. Would you? If someone you love passed today, would you want a ritual that made you feel their presence again, even for a heartbeat? That's what the Scythians were chasing, not a high, but a moment when the boundary between worlds dissolved, and the living and the dead exhaled together. Outside the tent, the stars hung heavy and silent over the steppe. Inside, the last ember hissed, the smoke faded, and for a brief second, the air was perfectly still, as if the gods themselves had inhaled. If the Scythians turned smoke into spirit, India turned spirit into ritual. Here, on the banks of the Ganges, under skies that smell of rain and incense, a new idea was taking root, that joy itself could be divine. The ancient Atharva Veda, one of Hinduism's 4 sacred texts, lists 5 plants said to be gifts from the gods. One of them was bang, cannabis. It was called a source of happiness, a liberator, a bringer of freedom. And it had a patron deity, Lord Shiva. According to legend, Shiva wandered beneath a cosmic tree, weary and sunstruck. He rested in its shade, tasted the leaves, and felt peace bloom behind his eyes. From that moment, he was the Lord of Bang, the god who found divinity through calm. Every year since, on the night of Mahashivaratri, millions stay awake in his honor. They dance, chant, and drink a pale green potion of milk, honey, almonds, and crushed cannabis. They call it Bang Lassi. It tastes sweet, earthy, and faintly electric, the flavor of both devotion and daring. Can you picture that scene? Torches flickering, bells echoing from temple walls, a river of white-clad worshippers swaying to drums. Would you drink from that cup, knowing it promised enlightenment and disorientation? Could you tell the difference between divine vision and simple euphoria? For India, there was no contradiction. The body and the soul weren't enemies, they were partners. If a plant opened the heart and quieted the mind, it wasn't sin, it was surrender. To sip bang was to taste the boundary between self and cosmos. In village courtyards, elders mixed it with warm milk to treat fever and anxiety. In monasteries, ascetics drank it before meditation to silence thought. And at festivals, entire cities hummed with gentle laughter. An entire civilization briefly united in bliss. Would you call that medicine, religion, or rebellion? Maybe all 3. Maybe those words only exist because later empires needed labels for things they couldn't control. Because here's the thing, no one in ancient India hid their use of cannabis. There were no moral panics, no whispered condemnations. To share a cup of bang was to share goodwill, a social handshake between mortals and gods. Even today, if you walk the narrow lanes of Varanasi during festival season, you'll find vendors grinding the same leaves on flat stones, pouring the same thick drink into clay cups, passing it to pilgrims with the same smile that's thousands of years old. It's continuity you can taste, sweet, spiced, and slightly dangerous. So ask yourself, would you stay up all night chasing enlightenment if it came in the form of a drink? If joy could make you holy, would you dare to sip it? And if the divine truly lived inside a humble green leaf, how long do you think humanity could resist worshipping it? Because while the rest of the ancient world still feared its gods, India toasted theirs. Not with sacrifice, but with milk and laughter. Not with sermons, but with smoke and song. In the end, Bang didn't just intoxicate, it invited. It taught humanity its next great lesson. That maybe heaven isn't a place above us, but a calm heartbeat waiting to be found within. By now, cannabis had shed its purely mystical skin and slipped into every corner of daily life. Across China, Persia, and the early city-states of Mesopotamia, hemp wasn't a curiosity anymore. It was infrastructure. Think of it, fields of pale green stalks waving under a clay-colored sky. Farmers harvesting fiber as tough as any metal they could forge. Women spinning thread finer than linen yet stronger than silk. Without speeches or songs, cannabis had become the uncredited engineer of civilization. In the river valleys of the Yellow and Yangtze, hemp ropes lashed rafts together, pulling timber down to growing towns. In Mesopotamia, scribes scratched on clay tablets while wearing sandals woven from hemp fiber. Egyptian fishermen cast hemp nets into the Nile and pulled up both dinner and legend. Every empire claimed it discovered the trick first. None of them cared who was right, as long as the ropes didn't snap. Would you have noticed the miracle if you were born then? Would you have seen those green stalks as sacred or just another crop under the sun? Do you think progress comes from grand inventions, or from humble threads binding one age to the next? When hemp arrived on the Mediterranean winds, it changed everything that moved. Sailcloth, rigging, bowstrings, tent lines, all spun from a plant that grew faster than trees and demanded little more than sunlight. Without hemp, explorers couldn't cross seas. Without its fiber, armies couldn't march far. Civilization, quite literally, hung by its strands. It's funny, isn't it? The same plant worshipped in temples and whispered about by mystics was now stitched into underwear and anchor ropes. Holiness had gone industrial. And yet, maybe that's the true genius of cannabis, its refusal to stay in one box. Sacred in one country, sailors' gear in another. Doctors' cure, farmers' crop, poets' muse, outlaws' sin. Some ancient texts describe the sound of hemp rope creaking on ships as the voice of the wind. Can you imagine that? The sea itself speaking through twisted strands of a plant first burned beside Stone Age fires? By 500 BCE, entire economies revolved around hemp production. Governments levied taxes on it. Soldiers guarded its trade routes. Scribes wrote decrees on hemp paper regulating its harvest, the first bureaucratic loop in history written on the very thing it governed. And somewhere out there, a Taoist monk was probably watching the whole system with a half smile, thinking, so this is what enlightenment looks like when it pays taxes. Would you have joined that trade, sailed those routes, hauled those bales, if you'd known the plant you were carrying would one day be banned for being too useful, too freeing, too human? Because that's the paradox taking shape already. Every time cannabis helps humanity stand taller, someone eventually tries to cut it down. But for now, under the ancient sun, hemp holds steady. It binds rafts, stitches sails, lifts cities. It's the silent partner in every triumph of the age. And as the first great ships push into open water, their ropes humming, their sails snapping, a quiet truth threads through history. Before steel, before empire, before religion itself, civilization learned to tie its fate to a plant that never asked for credit. China had entered its golden age of organization, the era of scrolls, scholars, and statecraft. Laws were written, philosophies debated, and somewhere in between, people quietly sought the kind of truth that didn't fit in government records. That's where the Taoists come in. To them, the universe wasn't a machine to control, it was a river to float in. Their goal wasn't power, but perception. And among their herbs, powders, and alchemical brews was one familiar green leaf, cannabis. They didn't smoke it in pipes or roll it in papers, not yet. They burned it as incense in mountain temples, the smoke rising in soft, lazy spirals toward carved rafters. The Taoist masters said it opened the gates of perception, that it allowed them to walk with the immortals, which, translated into modern terms, means they got high enough to believe they'd left their bodies behind. Picture a candlelit cavern, the scent of pine resin and hemp smoke drifting through the air. A monk sits cross-legged, eyes half closed, heartbeat slow. He isn't escaping reality, he's trying to merge with it. He believes the smoke carries him beyond words, beyond the bureaucracy of life itself. Would you trust that feeling? If a little smoke could make you feel infinite, would you chase it or fear it? Would you think you'd found the divine or just gotten dizzy? Not everyone approved, of course. For every mystic gazing at clouds, there was a Confucian scholar nearby, furrowing his brow and sharpening his quill. To the Confucians, enlightenment came through discipline and duty, not smoke and dreams. They saw the Taoists as lazy poets hiding behind incense burners. The Taoists saw the bureaucrats as blind men trying to measure the sky with a ruler. And somewhere in between those two worldviews, cannabis found itself on trial. Not in courts, but in philosophy. Is peace something you earn or something you inhale? Is enlightenment a process or an accident? The debate lasted centuries, and like all human debates, ended the same way. Everyone pretending to agree, then doing whatever they wanted behind closed doors. The truth is, cannabis in ancient China became a mirror. To the disciplined, it symbolized temptation. To the seekers, it symbolized freedom. To the government, it was just another thing to regulate. By the time the Han Dynasty arrived, records show the plant listed in imperial pharmacopoeias. Measured, taxed, categorized. You could almost hear the clerks asking the monks for forms. Please fill out this document before you transcend. Can you imagine it? The most organized civilization on Earth. Filing paperwork for enlightenment? But even under layers of ink and law, the smoke kept rising. In hidden mountain temples, Taoist adepts continued to burn hemp incense, believing it allowed them to see beyond death. And maybe, in a way, it did. Because while dynasties rose and fell, that quiet ritual endured. Would you have joined them on that mountain? Would you have knelt in the haze, breathing deeply, hoping to glimpse whatever lay beyond the veil? The irony, of course, is that China, the world's most bureaucratic empire, used the same plant for both paperwork and prophecy. They wrote their laws on hemp paper, then burned hemp smoke to dream beyond them. Maybe that's why cannabis survived so long here. It served every master, the scribe, the sage, the mystic, the tax collector. It was the one thing that made sense to everyone for entirely different reasons. And as the centuries passed, that smoke didn't just drift upward. It drifted outward, carried by merchants, monks, and wanderers. To the west, across the mountains, toward the next great highway of civilization, the Silk Road. Picture this, a caravan winding its way through a sea of sand. Camels grunt beneath sacks of silk, jade, and spices. Traders squint against the wind, scarves wrapped tight, their eyes full of fatigue and ambition. And somewhere among those countless bundles lies a small pouch of seeds, light, fragrant, and unassuming. Inside that pouch, history is hitching a ride. This is the Silk Road, the first global internet, where goods, gods, and gossip move faster than empires can keep track. And hidden among bolts of Chinese silk and jars of Persian perfume, cannabis begins its quiet conquest. It travels not with armies but with merchants. Not by decree but by curiosity. The plant's reputation spreads by word of mouth, stories whispered over campfires. A healer in China who brewed it for pain. A priest in India who drank it to see God. A nomad in the steppe who burned it to mourn the dead. Every culture reinterprets it, yet somehow the essence remains. This plant softens the edges of the world. Would you have stopped to listen to those stories as the wind howled across the desert? Would you have believed them, or laughed them off as traders' tales? Along the route, hemp becomes both tool and treasure. Persians weave it into ropes and sails. Chinese artisans press it into fine paper. Indian monks grind it into bang for festivals. Scythian descendants smoke it for the dead. One plant, 1,000 meanings. No empire ever planned this, and that's what makes it powerful. Because no general could conquer as efficiently as curiosity could. While nations fought, cannabis simply drifted. A green stowaway slipping across borders that armies bled to cross. By the time caravans reached Samarkand, the great jewel of Central Asia, hashish was already being traded in small clay jars, marketed as medicine for melancholy and sleeplessness. Doctors prescribed it. Poets praised it. and the guards at the city gates probably confiscated it and kept it for inspection. The Silk Road did more than move goods. It moved ideas. It taught people that pleasure, healing, and spirituality could share the same leaf. That maybe, just maybe, peace could be imported. But the further cannabis traveled, the more suspicion followed. In some cities, religious leaders warned that the plant tempted men to indolence. In others, mystics defended it as a key to divine understanding. For every merchant selling hemp fiber, there was another whispering about visions in the smoke. Which side would you have believed? The preacher warning of moral decay, or the poet promising enlightenment? Would you have tried it yourself just to see who was right? Some historians call cannabis the first truly globalized plant. Before wheat, before coffee, before tobacco, it crossed continents and cultures, not by force but by fascination. It didn't need missionaries, it had merchants. It didn't need propaganda, it had stories. And those stories grew like vines, tangling through languages and beliefs. In one land, cannabis was a healer. In another, a seducer. In another still, a doorway to truth. The irony is that none of the people carrying it along those ancient trade routes knew they were shaping the next 1,000 years of medicine, art, and rebellion. They just wanted to make a living. They didn't know that one day governments would spend fortunes trying to stop what the wind had already done for free. Can you imagine being one of those traders? Your camel creaking under the weight of silk and salt, a bag of seeds tucked in your satchel, not realizing you're carrying one of the most influential plants in human history? Because that's what cannabis was by then. Not just a product, but a passport, a universal symbol that slipped through borders, laws, and creeds, like smoke through fingers. By the time those caravans finally reached the Mediterranean, cannabis had already completed what no empire ever could, a peaceful invasion of the world. The desert cools at night in Persia. Lanterns flicker against limestone walls. Scholars sit cross-legged in circles, debating the structure of the soul. And somewhere nearby, a small bronze bowl releases a fragrant smoke that refuses to behave. The Persians didn't invent cannabis use, they refined it. They called it kanyabu, a word that sounds suspiciously like cannabis because, well, it is. To them, this was not a peasant's weed or a rebel's vice. It was a sacred medium, an invisible thread between human reason and divine fire. Their priests, the Magi, burned it during Zoroastrian rituals. They believed that the sweet vapors carried prayers upward, a fragrant elevator to the heavens. You can almost hear the logic. If fire was holy, then the smoke that rose from it must be halfway to God. Would you have believed that? Would you have stepped into that temple, the air thick and golden, and thought you were breathing the same atmosphere as eternity? The Magi weren't alone. Philosophers followed suit, because in Persia, no idea stayed sacred for long. They debated everything, the nature of time, the balance of good and evil, and soon, the moral geometry of getting pleasantly lightheaded in the name of wisdom. In the ancient Persian medical texts, cannabis appears beside frankincense and opium, prescribed for melancholy, pain, and what one doctor poetically called the heaviness of thinking too much. Tell me that isn't timeless. Would you have tried it just once if a sage said, "Take this, breathe deeply, and the burden of thought will lift"? Would you trust a plant more than a prayer? There's a famous line in Zoroastrian commentary that calls cannabis the bridge that unites the material and the spiritual. That's not the language of indulgence, it's the language of philosophy. Persia turned intoxication into inquiry. They believed the point wasn't to escape reality, but to understand it from a slightly higher altitude. Yet even here, suspicion crept in. The more freely ideas flowed, the more rulers worried. Because what happens when a man can find the divine? Without paying temple taxes or swearing loyalty to the throne, he becomes inconvenient. So decrees were issued. Priests were reminded to burn incense in moderation. And the line between holy smoke and heresy blurred like heat over sand. Can you see the pattern forming? Every time cannabis expands consciousness, someone with power contracts the rules. It's as if humanity can't decide whether this plant is a gift or a test. Still, the smoke kept rising. Persian poets wrote of it obliquely, calling it the whispering leaf. Mystics claimed it softened the veil between thoughts, and travelers carried that idea west, where Greek philosophers and Egyptian physicians would give it new names and new arguments. Picture it, a scholar sitting by a clay lamp, Scrolls spread before him, the scent of konjac curling upward. He exhales slowly, eyes half closed. And suddenly the stars above Persia don't look like distant fires. They look like questions waiting to be answered. Would you have joined him there, on that rooftop of reason and smoke, to ask the oldest question of all? If the gods live inside every breath, then what exactly are we inhaling? Because in that moment, long before anyone called it a drug or a crime, cannabis was something simpler. A thought made visible, a philosophy you could breathe. The Nile slides past the temples like liquid glass. Its banks glitter with reeds and the silhouettes of priests moving through incense haze. This is Egypt at its height, orderly, eternal, obsessed with the afterlife. And in the cool chambers of its sanctuaries, a new fragrance lingers. Not frankincense, not myrrh. Something earthier, something unmistakably alive. Cannabis. The Egyptians didn't worship it, not exactly. They used it with precision. In medicine, in ritual, and quietly in pleasure. To them, the line between healing and holiness was so thin it might as well not exist. The ancient Ebers Papyrus, a medical text from around 1500 BCE, lists cannabis as a remedy for inflammation, fever, glaucoma, and menstrual pain. It was mixed into honey, brewed into oils, and applied directly to wounds. Doctors called it the plant that eases the body and calms the heart. And when you live under a sun that never forgives, that's not just comfort, that's salvation. But the Egyptians were too clever to stop at medicine. They turned everything practical into ritual. Priests burned cannabis resin in censers during ceremonies, calling it Shemshemet, sacred smoke. They said it carried prayers up to Ra, the sun god. The scent filled tombs, temples, and even the royal bedchambers. It was the perfume of transcendence. Can you imagine standing there, in that temple half-lit by fire? The walls covered in hieroglyphs. As the smoke curled around statues of gold and black stone, would you have believed the gods were breathing it in with you? Would you have felt closer to eternity, or just comfortably lightheaded? For the living, cannabis soothed pain. For the dying, it was a gentle escort. Traces of it have been found in mummy wrappings, a final offering to help souls drift through the desert between worlds. Because if eternity was a journey, it made sense to bring along something to make the trip bearable. Midwives used cannabis to ease childbirth pain. Artisans rubbed hemp oil on sore joints after carving limestone in the heat. Pharaohs soaked their feet in cannabis-infused ointments after long processions. Even queens were said to apply it as a beauty balm, an early anti-aging secret lost in the sands of time. Would you have dared use it if the temple guards were watching? Would you have claimed it was medicine or faith? In Egypt, the two words were synonyms anyway. But beneath the divine fragrance lay an unspoken truth. The Egyptians, masters of control, were also masters of coping. Their world demanded perfection. The gods demanded obedience. And sometimes perfection needed a little help. Imagine centuries of building, praying, farming, waiting, generation after generation shaping stone into symbols of eternity. Wouldn't you want something to soften that weight? To make eternity feel a little lighter on your shoulders? The beauty of Egypt's relationship with cannabis is how quietly honest it was. No shame, no hysteria, just understanding that pain, whether of the body or the spirit, is best met with grace and a little green mercy. By the time Greek traders sailed up the Nile centuries later, they found a civilization already comfortable with the idea that smoke could be holy, that plants could be portals, that healing didn't always come from the heavens. Sometimes it sprouted from the dirt beneath your feet. Would you have believed them, those calm Egyptian doctors and priests, when they told you the gods prefer the scent of cannabis to gold? Or would you have feared the same thing so many civilizations would later fear? A plant that gave power to those who needed no permission to feel better? Because in Egypt, even the afterlife smelled faintly of hemp. And for a brief, miraculous chapter in history, heaven and earth shared the same perfume. By the time cannabis reached Greece, the world had already built temples for it, written hymns about it, and woven it into sails that carried explorers across the sea. But Greece gave it something new, an opinion. To the Greeks, nothing was sacred until it had been debated. They questioned everything: virtue, justice, friendship, even whether chairs were real. So when this strange new herb arrived from the east, smelling of earth and promise, the philosophers naturally did what philosophers do best. They argued about it for 200 years. Physicians like Hippocrates, the father of medicine, noted its use for inflammation and pain. He recommended hemp seeds for easing childbirth and calming fevers. Dioscorides, a few centuries later, wrote about it too, praising its ability to quiet pain of the joints and of the mind. That last phrase is the most Greek thing ever written. Physical therapy and philosophy in one prescription. Would you have trusted them? If Hippocrates himself handed you a clay jar and said, "Here, this will soothe both your body and your thoughts," would you have tried it? Or would you have been too afraid of feeling something you couldn't reason with? Because for all their intellect, the Greeks were also human. And humans, when faced with mystery, do what they always do. They test it, then moralize about it. To some, cannabis was a gift from the gods, a plant that eased pain and helped poets glimpse inspiration. To others, it was a distraction from discipline, a thief of focus. Sound familiar? Every generation rediscovers that same argument in a new accent. Imagine a smoky symposium in Athens. Bronze lamps flicker. Cups of diluted wine glimmer in the light. Philosophers recline on couches, togas loose, minds looser. Someone quotes Plato about the nature of reality. Someone else coughs and mutters, "Maybe reality's overrated." Laughter echoes off the marble. Would you have joined them to debate the meaning of virtue with the stars spinning just a little too fast overhead? For most Greeks, though, cannabis wasn't rebellion, it was medicine. Soldiers carried hemp poultices for wounds. Sailors wore hemp ropes across their shoulders. Everyday life was woven with it, literally and metaphorically. And that's the secret the philosophers sometimes forgot. The same plant that made them ponder existence also kept their ships afloat and their sandals tied. Still, in the shadow of the Parthenon, whispers persisted. Priests warned against overindulgence. Moralists tooted that too much pleasure softened the will. And yet, quietly, doctors kept prescribing it, poets kept praising it, and farmers kept planting it. It was a paradox Plato would have loved. A plant that both served and subverted order. You could call it nature's gentle rebellion. Would you have seen it that way, as something harmless yet quietly revolutionary? Or would you have stood with the priests, believing that anything that relaxed the body must also weaken the soul? Even the historian Herodotus, the same man who once watched Scythians hotbox a tent until they howled with pleasure, mentioned cannabis again when describing foreign lands. He didn't condemn it. He simply noted it as if to say, some truths are better experienced than explained. By the late Hellenistic age, cannabis had settled comfortably into Greek society. Medicine, material, metaphor. It was the philosopher's plant, logical yet mysterious, helpful yet humbling. Because no matter how much they analyzed it, the Greeks couldn't quite categorize it. And maybe that's the point. If reason is the pursuit of order, cannabis was the reminder that not all order needs control. That sometimes peace comes not from conquering thought, but from letting it drift. Would you have taken that lesson to heart, lying under olive trees with the Aegean wind in your hair, the scent of hemp and sea salt in the air? Would you have looked at the horizon and thought, perhaps the gods aren't above us after all? Maybe they're just waiting for us to breathe deeply enough to notice them. For Greece, the plant wasn't a revolution. It was a reflection. A calm, fragrant mirror held up to a people who loved to ask why. And, for a few moments at least, could finally stop asking. Rome didn't discover cannabis by accident. It inherited it from the Greeks, the Egyptians, and every nation it conquered. That's what Rome did best. It stole genius, rebranded it, and taxed it. In the bustling ports of the Mediterranean, bales of hemp arrived by the ton. Ropes, sails, thread, all spun from the same tough green fiber that had once perfumed Egyptian temples and inspired Indian prayers. Rome had no interest in divinity, it wanted durability. If a material could stretch across an empire, it was sacred enough. You can almost smell the docks, tar, sweat, salt, and hemp, the scent of expansion. Without it, Rome's fleets would have stayed in port, its armies stranded. Every conquest began with a rope. Would you have seen it that way if you'd been a Roman sailor pulling on a line that held half the known world together? Would you have thought of the plant beneath your fingers, or only of the horizon ahead? In workshops across the empire, hemp became everything. Sails for triremes, tents for legions, paper for scribes, oil for lamps, even clothes for the common man. It was the fabric of empire, literally. And yet, as always, Rome's relationship with pleasure complicated things. Wine was fine, as long as you didn't laugh too loudly. Food was glorious as long as you quoted a poet while eating. But smoke? Altered perception? That was barbarian behavior. Physicians still prescribed cannabis extracts for earaches, gout, and joint pain. The same ailments that plagued senators sitting too long and soldiers marching too far. Dioscorides, Rome's favorite Greek doctor, because Rome borrowed Greeks like we borrow Wi-Fi, wrote that hemp eases pain but dulls desire. That second part made it unpopular in the Senate. Roman women, on the other hand, loved its oil. They mixed it into beauty creams, applied it to soften skin, and whispered that it soothed monthly torments. In a world where the bathhouse was religion and vanity was civic duty, cannabis became a quiet ally. Can you picture the contrast? A marble villa overlooking the Tiber, a general boasting of victories while his wife's attendants grind hemp seeds into ointment in the courtyard below. Both serving Rome. Both pretending the other doesn't exist. Would you have dared use it if you were her? A noble woman expected to appear flawless but never indulgent? Would you have called it medicine, or rebellion disguised as self-care? The Romans never outlawed cannabis outright. They didn't have to. They buried it beneath layers of class and custom. Approved for the wounded, tolerated for the poor. Ignored by the powerful who preferred their vices imported and expensive. Still, it traveled with them everywhere. Roman soldiers carried hemp seeds to distant provinces, Gaul, Britannia, Africa, unknowingly turning half of Europe into future farmland for the world's most persistent plant. So while emperors toasted with wine and philosophers debated virtue, cannabis quietly held the empire together, strand by strand. The ropes that raised the sails that carried the legions that built the roads, all traced back to the same leaf once tossed into a prehistoric fire. Would you have noticed the poetry in that? That the same empire preaching restraint was literally bound by a plant that freed minds? That every expansion of Rome began with something that grew wild and free? Rome called it cannabis util, useful hemp. No hymns, no halos, no mysticism. Just another cog in the imperial machine. But history has a sense of humor. Because centuries later, when Rome crumbled under its own weight, the plant kept growing, indifferent, unstoppable. The Caesars fell. The roads cracked. The marble faded to dust. And in the ruins, somewhere between weeds and wildflowers, hemp sprouted again, as if to remind humanity that real empires don't rise on blood and bronze. They rise on roots. The old world has fallen quiet. Rome's legions are gone. The libraries of Alexandria are smoldering ruins. But the roads still exist, and the traders still walk them. The Silk Road hums again, a golden thread stretched across continents. And somewhere among the silk, salt, and silver, the old green traveler reappears. Cannabis, resilient, portable, profitable. Empires crumble, but plants don't care. They wait for the next set of hands to carry them forward. Caravans crawl across the desert. Persian merchants, Indian monks, Arab scholars, each carrying their own version of wisdom, faith, and occasionally a pouch of hashish. The smell of spice markets blends with the faint perfume of smoke and oil. At every stop, the story grows. In Samarkand, hemp ropes bind merchant crates and hemp paper holds the Quran's early verses. In Persia, apothecaries grind dried cannabis into balms for pain and melancholy. In northern Africa, farmers planted along the Nile again, this time for rope and medicine, not for mummification. And in distant monasteries of Central Asia, mystics rediscover what the Scythians once knew. Smoke makes prayer feel closer to breathing. Would you have followed that caravan, trading silk for spices, scrolls for seeds? Would you have been the one to tell the next town, try this, it makes the heart lighter and the mind wide as the sky? Because that's what happens next. The plant becomes a global rumor. No one remembers where it started, only that it works. It eases pain, calms grief, brightens thought, sometimes too much. It becomes the world's first open-source medicine. The traders don't write philosophy. They live it. They learn that a plant doesn't need nationality. It belongs to anyone brave enough to cultivate it. But not everyone approves. As Islamic scholars rise in Baghdad and Damascus, new moral codes begin to take shape. The Quran forbids alcohol but says nothing about cannabis, a loophole wide enough to ride a camel through. And so begins the age of hashish. Mystics embrace it, scholars tolerate it, rulers pretend not to notice. Hashish becomes the polite guest at every party, the quiet secret behind poetry, music, and conversation. Would you have taken it sitting beneath the stars of Damascus, listening to a Sufi poet whisper about the unity of all things? Would you have believed him when he said the smoke helped him hear God breathing? By the 9th century, cannabis had done what armies and prophets could not. It had connected humanity, from the steppes of Mongolia to the sands of Arabia, from the bazaars of Cairo to the ports of Zanzibar. The same scent drifted through the air, a reminder that pleasure, healing, and thought were not enemies, but parts of the same human hunger. Yet beneath that unity, the old tension simmered. Rulers saw how the plant loosened tongues and slowed obedience. Philosophers debated whether enlightenment found through smoke was true enlightenment at all. And so began a pattern that would repeat for the next 1,000 years. Acceptance followed by fear, tolerance followed by punishment. Still, the merchants kept moving, their camels plodding beneath an amber sun, their hands brushing the small sacks of green that would one day rewrite law and language alike. Can you picture it, that endless road? The rhythm of hooves, the jingle of harness rings, and the faint scent of hemp oil rising from every wagon axle. History wasn't being written in capitals anymore. It was being traded, whispered, carried in satchels across deserts. And through it all, cannabis remained what it had always been. A quiet survivor. A plant that didn't conquer but outlasted. When kings died and empires turned to dust, it still sprouted wherever sunlight touched soil. A simple truth wrapped in green. No power outlives what grows freely. The sun sets over Baghdad, and the city glows like a lantern. It is the crown of the world, where scholars debate under starlight, and merchants whisper deals beneath the call to prayer. The scent of spices and parchment fills the streets, and faintly something else drifts through the alleys, sweet, resinous, and unmistakably ancient. Hashish. In the early centuries of Islam, the faithful had a clear rule: alcohol was forbidden. But the Quran said nothing about this strange green resin arriving from the east. It didn't intoxicate like wine, it softened. It didn't drown the mind, it expanded it. And in that silence between law and experience, the world's first gray area bloomed. The scholars argued, was this plant a temptation from the devil or a gift from the Creator? Could something that made a man reflect also make him sin? Would you have joined that debate, sitting cross-legged in a Baghdad garden, listening to poets and priests trade verses about morality and meaning? Would you have sided with the jurists who feared pleasure, or with the mystics who believed joy was the purest form of prayer? Among the mystics, the Sufis took the plant's defense personally. They spun in circles, danced to drums, and inhaled deeply, not to escape the world but to merge with it. They called cannabis a veil lifter, a leaf that helped them hear the rhythm of God in their own heartbeat. In smoky corners of Cairo and Damascus, the faithful whispered another name for it: Al-Qadra, the Green One. They said it opened the gates of compassion, that it quieted ego and made prayer feel like music. Doctors joined in, though more discreetly. Physicians like Avicenna and Al-Razi wrote of cannabis in medical texts, prescribing it for melancholy, pain, and digestive troubles. They called it a cooling herb, one that steadied the nervous spirit. To them it wasn't sin, it was science. And yet, they wrote with caution, as if each word might be weighed in heaven. Would you have risked writing about it, knowing that one wrong phrase could make you both healer and heretic? Would you have told your patients it was divine mercy, or merely medicine? Because outside the libraries and mosques, something new was happening. Hashish dens, dim, fragrant rooms where merchants, artists, and philosophers gathered, began to appear from Egypt to Persia. There was no wine, no dancing girls, no gambling. Just smoke, laughter, and conversation that stretched until dawn. Ideas drifted between the cushions like clouds. Poetry, politics, love, theology, all filtered through the same haze. The authorities panicked, of course. Preachers thundered from pulpits that hashish softened the will of men. Governors banned it, raided the dens, and then quietly reopened them. Because their own scribes, guards, and advisors were all regulars. Would you have walked into one of those rooms? Sat cross-legged beside strangers, watching the smoke curl upward, wondering which was more powerful, the herb itself or the ideas it unleashed. By the 13th century, the smoke had spread faster than sermons. The poet Al-Azrili wrote odes to hashish as the bringer of calm. Meanwhile, conservative clerics called it the green heresy. Everyone agreed on one thing: it was changing people. And maybe that was the real threat. Not intoxication, Introspection. Because anyone who could find peace alone with a pipe was harder to command from a pulpit. The Sufis spun on, blissful and fearless. The rulers banned and unbanned the plant in cycles, each time realizing that you can outlaw a leaf, but not what it teaches. Would you have stood with the mystics, those who believed the smoke wasn't rebellion, but reverence in disguise? Would you have dared to find God in laughter? By the end of the Islamic Golden Age, cannabis had become a paradox wrapped in prayer. Condemned in law, loved in life. A sacred habit no sermon could erase. And from here, the story takes a darker turn. Because soon, a rumor will rise from the Persian mountains. A legend of assassins and intoxication that will stain this plant's name for centuries. The fortress of Alamut rises from the cliffs like a mirage. Stone upon stone, poised between sky and abyss. Here, in the high reaches of northern Persia, lives a man the empires call the Old Man of the Mountain. His name is Hassanai Sebah, and his legend will outlive him by 1,000 years. From these walls, his followers, the Nizari Ismailis, look down on a fractured world. Crusaders swarm from the west, caliphs scheme from the east, and between them, a handful of mountain rebels hold their ground through intellect, espionage, and something far more mysterious. Europe will later say it was hashish, that these men smoked before battle, their minds clouded by visions of paradise, that the drug made them fearless, devoted, unstoppable. That's the story the Crusaders will take home. And like all good propaganda, it's both nonsense and genius. Would you have believed it if you heard it secondhand? That killers in the East were high on sacred smoke? Would you have repeated it around a tavern fire, feeling brave for knowing the secret of another civilization? The truth was far less intoxicating and far more dangerous. Hassan's followers weren't drug zealots. They were disciplined thinkers, trained in strategy, mathematics, and languages. They used stealth, not smoke. But to explain their precision, their enemies needed a myth. So they invented one. Hashish became the convenient scapegoat. Hashishin, they called them the hash users. The word would slither through languages for centuries until it hardened into a single syllable. Assassin. Would you have noticed how easily the rumor spread? How quickly fear travels when wrapped in the scent of exotic smoke. Chroniclers wrote that Hassan lured young men into his fortress, drugged them with hashish, and showed them a false paradise filled with rivers of wine and women. When they awoke, he promised they could return, if they died for him. It was the perfect horror story for medieval Europe. Pleasure as poison, faith as manipulation, cannabis as sin. But historians now know the story was a lie, crafted by rival empires desperate to explain why a few mountain rebels kept humiliating entire armies. It was easier to say they were high than to admit they were smarter. Still, the damage was done. A single false tale turned an herb of peace into a symbol of blood. Hashish went from sacred to sinister in the stroke of a quill. Can you feel the irony? The same plant used by Sufi mystics to seek God was now said to fuel murder. Two truths, one leaf, and humanity chose the one that frightened it more. Would you have believed the myth or questioned it? Would you have trusted the chroniclers or gone to the mountains yourself to see what really burned in those censers? In reality, the men of Alamut spent their nights reading philosophy and astronomy. They cultivated gardens, preserved knowledge, and built one of the most advanced libraries in Persia. The only smoke there came from oil lamps and incense. But rumor doesn't care about facts. When the Mongols finally razed Alamut in 1256, they found no drug killers, only scholars and scrolls. But the legend had already escaped into Europe. And from that point on, cannabis would carry two faces: the healer and the heretic, the mystic's gift and the assassin's curse. Would you have tried to defend its reputation? Or would you have realized even then that truth rarely survives once fear gets a headline? So the word assassin entered the world. And with it, the first great smear campaign against a plant that had done nothing but make people think. From sacred to scandalous in one generation. History's fastest moral collapse. And yet, the smoke still rose. Even as the mountains burned, somewhere in a Cairo courtyard, a poet was lighting his pipe, smiling at the absurdity of it all. Because while myths conquer minds, cannabis, stubborn, ancient, green, just keeps growing. Europe in the Middle Ages was a place of shadows and sermons. The cathedrals reached for heaven, but the people mostly reached for survival. Between plagues, crusades, and the crushing weight of divine authority, There wasn't much room left for experimentation, especially the kind that smelled suspiciously foreign. Cannabis had already been here for centuries, quietly. Farmers grew it for rope, for sails, for oil. Monks spun it into parchment and prayer cords. It was as ordinary as wheat. But when stories began arriving from the east, tales of hashish eaters, of assassins drugged into zealotry, suddenly the plant had a new name, Herba Diaboli, the devil's herb. Would you have believed it, sitting by the hearth as a crusader returned from the Holy Land, describing strange Eastern men who smoked madness into their souls? Would you have shivered or laughed or asked to try it yourself? Fear is contagious. Soon, church sermons warned that the herb opened the gates of sin. Herbalists who once prescribed it for pain began hiding their notes. Midwives who had used it for childbirth for generations were suddenly branded as witches. It was the beginning of Europe's oldest and ugliest habit, turning wisdom into heresy. And yet, the hypocrisy was thick as incense. Inside monastery gardens, hemp still flourished. Monks used its fibers to make sacred paper for copying the Bible, and its oil to fuel their lamps during all-night vigils. They just didn't talk about the other uses. The ones whispered in the infirmary, where a wounded brother might be given a calming salve to ease his pain. Would you have dared to grow it, knowing a single stalk could damn you in the eyes of the church? Would you have whispered its name in the marketplace, or buried the seeds behind your cottage like contraband hope? By the 14th century, the contradiction was everywhere. The church condemned the devil's weed, yet its ships sailed on hempen ropes. Its banners waved from hempen cloth. Even the parchment of papal decrees was made from hemp paper. Europe was literally bound together by the plant it was trying to destroy. The Inquisition came next, and if you think it stopped at heretics, think again. Herbalists, healers, and women who brewed green tonics were dragged from villages, accused of devilry. Their crimes? Knowledge. Their evidence? Plants. Would you have stood by them, the women in linen aprons clutching bundles of dried herbs? Or would you have joined the crowd, chanting for their purification? Would you have believed the smell of hemp smoke was proof of sorcery? Europe had entered its long sleep of fear. Knowledge went underground. The libraries locked their doors. The church replaced science with scripture and curiosity with guilt. And somewhere, in a small stone cottage on the edge of a damp field, a midwife still rubbed hemp oil on her aching hands and whispered, "God forgive me, but it works." The truth is, the plant never disappeared. It just learned to keep quiet. Through the Middle Ages, hemp remained the backbone of European trade. Rope for ships, sails for explorers, fabric for soldiers. Everyone used it, but no one admitted it. It was the perfect European compromise. Condemn in public, profit in private. Would you have noticed the irony watching a priest read from hemp paper about the evils of the same plant? Would you have laughed or been too afraid to? By the dawn of the Renaissance, Europe was ready to wake up, and cannabis, silent but patient, was waiting. Its seeds were already packed aboard ships bound for new continents, hidden among the cargo that would reshape the world. The plant that had once been medicine, myth, and menace was about to become something even bigger, a global commodity. Because no matter how tightly fear grips a civilization, you can't burn an idea that grows back every spring. The bells of Florence ring over a city reborn. Painters grind pigments, astronomers polish lenses, and merchants count coins under vaulted ceilings. Europe has woken up, and in its rush to rediscover the world, it stumbles upon an old friend hiding in plain sight. Cannabis, the green thread that never really left. After centuries of suspicion, the Renaissance brings back the art of asking why. And in those questions, about medicine, mechanics, and nature, the plant re-emerges as a quiet genius. Doctors study it again, unafraid this time. Apothecaries bottle cannabis sativa, tinctures for headaches, gout, and sleeplessness. Sailmakers rediscover its fibers' unmatched strength. Printers realize hemp paper lasts longer than animal parchment. Even painters mix hemp oil into pigments to make their colors shine for centuries. The same glow that lights up the canvases of Da Vinci and Vermeer. Would you have trusted it again if you'd lived then? After hearing it called devil's weed your whole life, would you have dared to crush its leaves between your fingers and see what truth really smelled like? Renaissance scholars began rewriting old herbals, the encyclopedias of the natural world. And there, nestled between mandrake and rosemary, hemp returned, described not as a sin but as a symbol of ingenuity. It was the age of rediscovery, and the church, too busy with art commissions and politics, quietly stopped caring about one little green plant. Sailors benefited most. Every ship that left for the New World was practically built out of hemp. Ropes, sails, nets, oakum, tar. Even the maps and journals that chronicled those voyages were drawn on hemp paper. Without it, there would have been no Columbus, no Magellan, no age of exploration. The irony? The devil's plant had become the engine of empire. Would you have boarded one of those ships, knowing your fate and your sails depended on a plant once banned for heresy? Would you have looked at the horizon and thought, maybe nature knows more about freedom than the church ever did? Artists too found comfort in it. In smoky taverns and quiet studios, cannabis oil became a balm for tired hands and restless minds. Some whispered that Michelangelo himself used the painter's tonic to calm his nerves after days on scaffolds. True or not, it fits the mood of the age. The belief that inspiration and intoxication might be closer cousins than anyone dared admit. Meanwhile, physicians in Venice, Paris, and London experimented with cannabis extracts. They called it a blessed sedative. It eased pain, softened melancholy, and helped scholars sleep after nights spent arguing about whether the earth truly moved around the sun. Would you have taken it, a few drops before bed, knowing you were swallowing the same extract used by doctors, sailors, and dreamers alike? Would you have wondered whether it was healing your body or expanding your mind? By the late 1500s, Europe's hemp industry was booming. Kingdoms fought not over gold, but over rope. England's navy consumed entire fields of it every year. Hemp became so valuable that Queen Elizabeth I ordered farmers to grow it, or pay a fine. The very monarchy that once feared which herbs now depended on one. The Renaissance gave cannabis a new image, not a symbol of sin or sanctity, but of progress. A plant for makers, thinkers, builders, and explorers. It had survived every purge, every prejudice, every pyre. And now it stood at the edge of a new world, ready to cross the ocean again. Would you have realized, standing on the docks as the wind filled those hempen sails, that this humble plant was about to begin its greatest journey yet, one that would change the history of continents? Because soon, it will land in a place where freedom is preached, profit is king, and contradictions grow even faster than crops. The new world awaits, and cannabis, as always, is already packed for the trip. The wind howls against the sails of empire. Wood creaks, ropes strain, and the ocean swallows every sound except the groan of destiny. Below deck, stacked among barrels of salt pork, gunpowder, and prayer books, lies a small sack of seeds, brown, ordinary, almost invisible. But these seeds will take root in a continent that doesn't yet have a name for them. Cannabis has crossed another frontier. This time not as medicine or sacrament, but as infrastructure. Every ship in the age of exploration depended on hemp. Without it, there were no ropes to hoist sails, no canvas to catch the wind, no nets to feed the crew, no oakum to seal the hulls. If God built the ocean, hemp built the ships that dared to cross it. Would you have realized it, watching the horizon blur between sky and sea? That every inch of progress, every map drawn in wonder or conquest, was held together by the same plant once outlawed by priests? In 1545, the Spanish carried hemp to Chile. The Portuguese followed, planting it along the coasts of Brazil. And when English settlers arrived in Virginia a century later, King James I himself issued a decree. Every colonist shall plant hemp for the crown. The settlers obeyed. They planted fields of green that rustled like the sea. Hemp became rope, cloth, paper, oil, and quietly currency. In a world without coin or credit, a man could trade hemp for tools, grain, or even freedom. Would you have planted it too if the king demanded it? Would you have cared that it was sacred once, or simply seen it as survival? But behind every empire, there's labor and suffering. The same ships that carried hemp across the Atlantic also carried slaves. On the plantations of the Caribbean, enslaved Africans tended the crops that made Europe rich: sugar, tobacco, cotton, and yes, hemp. They wove the ropes that bound their own lives. The irony was brutal. The plant that once symbolized peace now served power. It clothed the conquerors, rigged the slave ships, and tied the sails of empire with quiet indifference. Would you have noticed that contradiction? Or, like so many, would you have called it progress and looked away? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, whispers returned from Africa and India. Sailors told stories of ganja smoked in clay pipes, of laughter in the fields and calm after storms. Some began growing a different kind of hemp, shorter, leafier, richer in resin. The kind that didn't just build ships, the kind that built moods. And so, a split began between hemp and marijuana, between fiber and flower, rope and ritual. Two names for the same plant, destined to walk separate paths for centuries. In Europe and the colonies, hemp remained an industry, respectable, taxable, essential. In the shadows, its intoxicating cousin began to travel quietly among sailors, servants, and slaves, carried in pouches, pipes, and stories. It was still too early to call it rebellion, but the idea was germinating that this plant wasn't just useful, it was liberating. Would you have been one of those sailors, sharing a pinch of green under the stars, laughing softly at the absurdity of kings and crowns? Would you have realized that even then the plant was beginning to shift sides, from empire's servant to freedom's symbol? By the late 1600s, hemp had become the skeleton of colonial economies. It built ships, clothed settlers, and kept lamps burning through endless winters. And yet, in the corners of ports and plantations, another story was forming, of people who found peace, pleasure, and even defiance in a few crushed leaves. The seeds had been sown, literally and metaphorically. Hemp built the empire. Cannabis would one day challenge it, because sooner or later, every empire that tries to control everything must face the one thing it can't, a plant that grows wherever it pleases. The new world smells like sweat, salt, and sawdust, a raw civilization under construction. Settlers hack through wilderness, priests ring their bells, and farmers bend over endless fields. Among the corn and tobacco, a quieter crop waves in the wind. Hemp, the king's plant. It's everywhere, used for ropes, canvas, paper, and cloth. Without it, the colonies would fall apart. Every ship that sails, every wagon that rolls, every musket cleaned, all rely on hemp. It's the invisible backbone of survival. But history, as always, has a sense of irony, because this royal crop will soon belong to a people planning a revolution. Would you have planted it if you knew it was the same plant used by kings? Or would you have smiled at the idea that one day, those ropes might hang their flags instead? In Virginia, George Washington grows hemp at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson experiments with strains at Monticello. They write about it in journals, calling it an invaluable resource. No one hides it. It's patriotism in plant form, strong, versatile, American. Washington even complains one year that the male and female hemp are not separated properly. A founding father worried about pollination. Proof that even revolutionaries have gardening problems. Would you have guessed, watching him walk those fields, that the future president of the United States was already relying on a plant that his descendants would one day outlaw? By the mid-1700s, hemp was so vital that farmers were legally required to grow it. Taxes could be paid in hemp. Bales of it built fortunes and funded independence. When Paul Revere rode through the night shouting, "The British are coming," his saddlebag straps were made of hemp. So were the sails of the ships that carried the Continental Army's supplies. Freedom, quite literally, was woven from cannabis. But even as hemp soared in status, its psychoactive sibling began drifting quietly through the lower decks of society. Sailors brought seeds from Africa and India. Indentured workers carried them to the Caribbean. On sugar plantations, enslaved Africans cultivated it for medicine, worship, and relief. They called it ganja, a word from Sanskrit that traveled as far as they did. At night, they passed clay pipes beneath the stars, finding in smoke a small, stolen moment of peace. Would you have joined them, tired, beaten, nameless, and inhaled just to remember that freedom still existed somewhere inside you? In Jamaica and Brazil, the plant became part of ritual and resistance. In Cuba, soldiers used hemp oil for wounds. In the American colonies, midwives still brewed hemp tea for childbirth and pain. It was medicine for the poor, fabric for the rich, and livelihood for everyone in between. Yet even here, in the age of reason, the shadow of fear remained. The same plant praised by presidents was condemned by preachers. They warned that the devil hides in comfort. But comfort, in a world built on hardship, was its own quiet revolution. Would you have believed the preacher or the farmer? Would you have trusted the sermon or the seed? By the dawn of the 19th century, the two faces of cannabis, hemp and marijuana, had fully split. Hemp was empire, respectable, industrial, taxed. Marijuana was soul, spiritual, subversive, untamed. Two sides of the same leaf, one building nations, the other healing those nations' wounds. And though the colonies had won their freedom, a new struggle was already brewing, not for land or liberty, but for control of truth itself. Because as science began to understand the plant's chemistry, politics began to fear its symbolism. The plant that built the sails of revolution was about to become the scapegoat of progress. Would you have seen it coming, that the same green field that birthed independence would one day be fenced off by laws and lies? The seeds of empire had grown tall, but in their shade, a smaller, freer sprout was already reaching for sunlight. Picture it: London, Paris, Calcutta, cities humming with invention. Steam engines roar. Printing presses rattle. Philosophers argue in coffee houses while surgeons sharpen their scalpels under candlelight. Humanity, for the first time in centuries, believes it can understand everything, even the soul. And into this laboratory of ambition walks a familiar guest: cannabis. For thousands of years, it was a mystery wrapped in smoke and superstition. Now, men in powdered wigs and spectacles want to measure it, name it, and bottle it. Would you have trusted them? The same society that once called the plant heresy, now calling it the next frontier of medicine? In 1798, Napoleon's soldiers returned from Egypt with more than sand in their boots. They bring stories of local men inhaling a green resin that makes laughter last for hours. French doctors take notes. Chemists grind the samples, taste them, heat them, and record the effects in elegant cursive. The verdict? Hashish stimulates the imagination, reduces pain, and promotes tranquility. Science, at last, has words for what shamans knew millennia before. In India, under British rule, hemp use is so widespread that colonial officials can't ignore it. So they do what bureaucrats always do: form a committee. The 1894 Indian Hemp Drugs Commission report becomes one of history's most detailed studies of cannabis. Over 3,000 interviews. Doctors, priests, prisoners, farmers. The conclusion? Moderate use causes little harm. Prohibition would be unjust and impractical. Would you have believed them? Or would you have sensed that politics was already preparing to ignore its own evidence? Meanwhile, Europe's great doctors are busy experimenting. In 1839, Irish physician William O'Shaughnessy publishes his findings from Calcutta. He describes how cannabis oil reduces seizures, relieves pain, and calms muscle spasms. He brings the discovery back to England, and within a decade, extractum cannabis appears in pharmacies from London to New York. Victorian medicine bottles line the shelves. For sleeplessness, for melancholy, for hysteria. Every respectable doctor prescribes it. Every patient trusts it. Would you have taken it? A few drops on your tongue from a dark glass bottle, believing it could quiet both pain and memory? Writers take notice too. Charles Baudelaire, Alexandre Dumas, and Victor Hugo gather in Paris as part of Le Club des Hachishins, the club of the hashish eaters. They sit in velvet chairs, eat honeyed cannabis paste, and chase visions through clouds of perfume and poetry. They aren't criminals. They're celebrities. Hashish is fashionable, philosophical, decadent, the muse of the industrial age. But with popularity comes anxiety. Religious leaders condemn it as the new opium. Governments, fearful of the unpredictable, begin regulating sales. Doctors argue over dosage. Newspapers print both miracles and moral panic. Would you have been swept up in the excitement? Or worried that humanity was once again too eager to classify what it didn't understand? For a brief, glittering century, cannabis stands in the light. It heals soldiers returning from wars, soothes sleepless industrialists, and inspires poets to write about the infinite. But the same industrial revolution that gave it fame will soon make it a target. Factories demand discipline. Governments demand obedience. And a plant that relaxes the mind doesn't fit neatly into either plan. By the mid-1800s, the seeds of suspicion are sprouting again. Medicine is becoming industry. And industry doesn't like anything that can't be patented. Would you have noticed the shift? From curiosity to control, from wonder to regulation? Would you have seen that once again? Humanity was turning knowledge into fear, and nature into property, because the Enlightenment had made one crucial mistake. It thought understanding meant ownership. And as the lights of science burned brighter, the shadows of greed began to gather, ready to swallow the plant all over again. The 19th century is the age of invention. Steam, steel, electricity. Factories roar. Empires tighten their grip. Every empire needs order, efficiency, and obedience. But cannabis? Cannabis makes people pause, reflect, and laugh at the absurdity of it all. So naturally, it becomes a problem. In Europe and America, doctors still sell cannabis extracts in apothecaries. But the bottles now sit beside something far stronger. Morphine, cocaine, laudanum. The industrial chemists have taken over. They crave control, exact doses, patentable formulas, measurable profits. A plant that grows anywhere doesn't fit that business model. Would you have noticed that shift? How medicine stopped being about healing and started being about ownership? Would you have realized that the problem wasn't the plant? It was that no one could trademark nature? As colonialism spreads, cannabis follows and gets blamed for everything. In India, British officials worry it makes workers too content. In Egypt, colonial doctors say it causes laziness and rebellion. In Mexico, American newspapers print lurid tales of marijuana-crazed fiends. Everywhere the same pattern. When the poor and the colonized use the plant, it's a vice. When the rich and the white use it, it's a cure. Would you have questioned that double standard? Or would you, like most people then, have believed whatever headline made you feel safe? By the late 1800s, moral crusades sweep across Europe and America. The same societies that binge on alcohol and morphine now panic over plants. Reformers call for purity. Politicians call for votes. And the first anti-cannabis laws appear, not from science but from fear. In 1870, British colonies begin taxing hemp in India. In 1906, the U.S. Pure Food and Drug Act quietly reclassifies cannabis as a poison. By 1910, Mexican immigrants fleeing revolution bring their culture and their smoke to the American Southwest. The plant isn't new. The prejudice is. American newspapers coin a foreign-sounding word to make it easier to fear. Marijuana. Would you have recognized that word as a weapon? Would you have realized it wasn't about the drug, but about the people blamed for using it? Meanwhile, the industrialists make their move. William Hearst, the newspaper tycoon, owns forests and paper mills, and hates hemp, which can make cheaper paper. DuPont, the chemical giant, patents nylon and synthetic plastics, and fears hemp fiber will compete. Together, they find allies in politics and press. Soon, headlines scream about the killer weed. Pictures of wild-eyed immigrants and jazz musicians fill the front pages. The war isn't on drugs. It's on culture. Would you have fallen for it? The propaganda, the panic, the perfect storm of racism and profit? Would you have believed that the same plant used by your grandmother for headaches was suddenly turning men into monsters? By 1930, America forms the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, led by Harry Anslinger, a man who once called cannabis harmless, until Prohibition gave him a career. He tells Congress it causes madness, violence, and racial mixing. The newspapers echo every word. And by 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act makes the plant effectively illegal. The empire that cannabis helped build now outlaws it. Its sales, ropes, paper, and medicines erased by ink and fear. Would you have protested? Or would you have stayed silent, believing the experts knew best? In less than a century, the oldest friend of humanity becomes its most demonized. A plant worshipped by priests, used by healers, and loved by poets, is now branded a poison. Its users criminals, its growers hunted, its story rewritten. But history has a long memory. And truth, like the plant itself, has roots too deep to die. Because even as governments burned fields and jailed users, somewhere, in an attic, a jungle, a quiet backyard, the smoke still rose. Would you have joined them, those quiet rebels tending their forbidden gardens, knowing that every seed was an act of defiance? Would you have believed that one day the world would circle back and ask again, what were we so afraid of? It's midnight in Harlem, 1935. The trumpets moan, the bass walks, and the smoke curls slow and lazy through the club. A saxophone cries like a confession. This is the sound of a people inventing joy in a world that keeps trying to steal it. And somewhere in the corner, a small hand-rolled cigarette glows between fingers. Sweet, sharp, illegal. Cannabis, now called reefer, has found its new home. The same plant that once filled royal gardens and colonial ships now slips quietly into the hands of jazz musicians, poets, and dreamers. It's cheap, calming, and creative, everything the Great Depression isn't. Louis Armstrong calls it my inspiration. Billie Holiday smokes before every show to still her nerves. Writers in New Orleans, Kansas City, and Chicago pass joints between verses and solos, chasing rhythm like revelation. Would you have joined them in those cramped, sweaty rooms where music feels like survival? Where every note sounds like defiance wrapped in laughter? But outside the clubs, America is panicking again. Harry Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, needs a new villain to justify his budget. He finds one in marijuana and in the people who use it. Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men, he tells Congress. The primary users are Negroes, Hispanics, and entertainers. Fear, racism, and politics, the unholy trinity of control, light the match. Would you have recognized it for what it was? Not a war on drugs, but a war on difference? The newspapers explode with hysteria. Headlines scream, "Marijuana, the assassin of youth." Posters show women screaming, men losing their minds. White teenagers corrupted by colored jazz and devil smoke. It's absurd and it works. Fear always does. In 1937, Congress passes the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively criminalizing the plant across the nation. Doctors protest, chemists argue, but no one listens. Anslinger wins. Cannabis goes underground. In Harlem, the raids begin. Police storm clubs, arrest musicians, and confiscate instruments still warm from the last set. Billie Holiday, Lady Day, becomes their favorite target. She's black, brilliant, and unafraid. Her song, Strange Fruit, condemns America's lynchings. Anslinger vows to destroy her. He has her arrested, her cabaret license revoked, her career shattered. She dies handcuffed to a hospital bed in 1959. Her crime? Addiction, defiance, and being black in a country that feared both. Would you have stood with her? When the agents came, when the headlines turned, when silence seemed safer. Meanwhile, the jazzmen keep playing. They roll joints behind stage curtains and hide pipes in trumpet cases. The music grows freer, wilder, harder to police. The sound of improvisation becomes the sound of resistance. Every solo a protest, every exhale a prayer. By the 1950s, the reefer menace spreads to Hollywood. Actors and writers are dragged before committees, their reputations ruined by whispers of smoke. The word marijuana becomes taboo, something whispered in alleys, not in art. But truth, like rhythm, can't stay hidden. Because in those same years, the beat generation rises. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Neil Cassidy. They light up in diners and desert highways, writing poetry that smells of rebellion and hash. Their mantra, freedom at any cost. Their soundtrack, jazz. Their medicine, weed. Would you have been one of them? A beat poet with a notebook and a joint? Dreaming of a country that lives up to its own promise of liberty? By 1960, the seeds of another revolution are germinating. The music, the poetry, the quiet defiance, all carry one shared scent. Cannabis isn't just a drug anymore. It's an idea. A symbol of peace in a nation addicted to war. A plant that says, "You don't own my mind." And soon that whisper will become a roar. Because the next generation won't just smoke in jazz clubs. They'll march in streets, paint on walls, sing from stages, and call it what it truly is, freedom. It's 1967, San Francisco. The summer of love. Bare feet on grass. Guitars humming. Drums echoing off Victorian rooftops. And everywhere, the sweet, earthy scent of cannabis in the wind. The generation that grew up under mushroom clouds now finds salvation in a plant. They call it peace, love, expansion, and sometimes just a good trip. To their parents, it's madness. To them, it's awakening. Would you have joined them, on the hillside, joint in hand, watching the sun sink into the bay while strangers turned into family? This is the era when cannabis transforms from taboo to anthem, from whispered vice to the language of protest. In college campuses across America, students roll joints before rolling into demonstrations. Against war, against segregation, against conformity itself. The same plant once vilified by governments now becomes the banner of resistance. If the establishment says it's evil, the youth assume it must be good. Vietnam rages. Televisions show boys barely out of high school burning villages and being buried in foreign soil. And back home, people light up, not to escape, but to understand, to connect, to breathe when the world feels unlivable. Would you have smoked as a statement, not of pleasure, but of protest? Music carries the message further than politics ever could. Bob Dylan, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, they don't just sing songs, they shape consciousness. John Lennon writes, "Imagine." Jimi Hendrix turns distortion into prophecy. And everywhere, smoke drifts through the chords like incense in a secular church. Festivals become pilgrimages. Monterey, Woodstock, Isle of Wight. 500,000 people in mud, rain, and music, passing joints like communion, truly believing, that peace could win. Would you have gone to Woodstock barefoot and euphoric, believing that love and weed could rewrite history? But history as always resists. The state strikes back. President Richard Nixon calls drugs public enemy number one. He launches the war on drugs, a campaign dressed as morality but aimed at politics. In private, Nixon's aides admitted, "We couldn't make it illegal to be black or against the war, but by associating the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, we could disrupt both communities." Would you have known then, sitting cross-legged under a tie-dye sky, that your freedom song had just been declared a threat to the nation? Arrests skyrocket. Police tear through campuses. Families fracture across generations. The plant of peace becomes a political weapon once again. Yet even as they handcuff students, even as soldiers return home broken, the idea behind cannabis refuses to die. Because cannabis had become something far bigger than intoxication. It was identity. A quiet rebellion against a system addicted to control. For the first time, mainstream scientists start studying it, not as poison but as puzzle. Doctors note its effects on pain, appetite, anxiety. Philosophers call it consciousness expansion. Poets call it truth smoke. And ordinary people, exhausted by war, by hypocrisy, call it peace. Would you have risked arrest to feel that peace? Would you have taken that hit in the name of something larger than yourself? A belief that freedom starts inside the mind? By 1975, the haze of the 60s has thinned, but the seeds are everywhere, in art, law, medicine, and memory. The dream of peace may have stumbled, but the plant that symbolized it keeps growing. Cannabis has survived emperors, inquisitions, and industrialists. Now it's surviving presidents. And quietly, in basements, communes, and college towns, a movement is forming that will outlast the century. Because if the 1960s were the spark, the decades ahead will be the slow burn, and the world will never breathe quite the same again. The 1970s end in smoke, not incense but tear gas. The war on drugs has grown teeth. Politicians smile for cameras while signing laws that cage entire generations. And somewhere, a single green leaf becomes the most dangerous symbol in America. Would you have known, rolling a joint in your apartment, that the government saw you as the enemy? The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 * lists cannabis as Schedule 1. No medical value, high potential for abuse. Alongside heroin. Doctors protest. Scientists laugh. The law doesn't care. Truth has never stood a chance against politics. Nixon's gone, but his war lives on. Then comes Reagan. A smile sharper than policy. A camera-ready crusade for family values. In 1982, the White House launches Just Say No. Billboards bloom like moral weeds. A joint equals jail. A seed equals sin. And somewhere in a suburban living room, a teenager wonders why his father's whiskey isn't on the poster. Would you have believed those commercials? The frying pan that told you, this is your brain on drugs? Or would you have looked closer at who owned the networks airing them? As penalties stiffen, prisons fill. In 1970, about 200,000 Americans sit behind bars. By 1990, over 1 million. Half for non-violent drug offenses. Most of them poor. Many of them black or Latino. Families break apart. Entire communities erased by tough love legislation. The plant never cared who you were. The laws did. Would you have called it justice? Or genocide with paperwork? Meanwhile, the war moves south. Latin America becomes a battlefield of supply and demand. Crops destroyed, farmers executed, while American consumers still light up behind closed doors. Every crackdown spawns a cartel. Every cartel feeds another crackdown. It's a perfect loop of hypocrisy. Funded by fear, enforced by fire. In the shadows, smugglers turn into legends. Planes skim over the Caribbean. Boats slip through Florida swamps. Border patrols chase ghosts through jungles of smoke. The price of rebellion now counts in lives. Would you have joined the underground? The growers in Oregon, the hippies in Humboldt, the veterans treating their trauma with illegal leaves? Would you have risked prison for peace of mind? Yet, even as propaganda floods the airwaves, cracks appear in the wall of denial. In the 1980s, doctors rediscover cannabis's power to ease pain, to restore appetite for cancer and AIDS patients. In 1988, DA Judge Francis Young holds hearings. After months of testimony, he declares, marijuana in its natural form is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. The government buries the report, but truth like smoke finds its way out. The 1990s bring whispers of rebellion turned reform. Voters in California push Proposition 215, the first law to legalize medical marijuana in 1996. For the first time in 60 years, the tide begins to turn. Doctors step forward again. Patients tell their stories on TV. Grandmothers with arthritis, veterans with nightmares, children with seizures soothed by a few drops of oil. Would you have believed them then? After decades of propaganda telling you they were criminals? Would you have had the courage to vote yes? By the end of the century, the fear still lingers, but the silence is breaking. A plant once demonized by emperors, priests, and presidents is beginning its slow climb back into the light. The war that was supposed to end it has only proved its resilience. Cannabis has outlasted every crusade against it, and now it's ready to be seen again not as a crime, but as a mirror reflecting what power fears most: freedom that can't be taxed. The century turns. The world, once terrified of a leaf, is starting to remember. In California, 1996, the votes are counted. Proposition 215 passes. For the first time in modern history, cannabis is legal, again. Not for pleasure, but for compassion. Cancer patients, veterans, the chronically ill. The same government that once called them criminals now quietly admits they were right all along. Would you have voted yes, knowing you were defying 70 years of fear? Or would you have hesitated, waiting for permission to feel empathy? From that moment, the world begins to turn green again. Other states follow: Oregon, Washington, Colorado. Then countries: Canada, Uruguay, Portugal, Thailand. Each one discovering the same truth buried by centuries of lies: that healing and harm were never the same thing. Scientists return to the plant like archaeologists to a forgotten temple. They find compounds with impossible names: THC, CBD, CBN, molecules that calm pain, silence tremors, ease despair. Hospitals begin prescribing extracts. Labs publish papers once banned. Doctors who once feared to speak now testify in courtrooms. Would you have trusted the science? After decades of government pamphlets saying it would rot your brain? Would you have dared to believe that maybe the stoners were healers in disguise? A new generation is born into a world that talks about strains, terpenes, and microdosing as casually as their grandparents once talked about coffee. Cannabis companies rise from basements to boardrooms. Stock markets smell faintly of pine and rebellion. Billion-dollar brands sell serenity in sleek glass jars. The same system that outlawed the plant now monetizes it. The ultimate irony of capitalism. Would you have joined that industry? Or walked away, remembering those still imprisoned for the same plant now sold in boutiques? Because not everyone got free when the laws changed. Thousands still sit in cells for crimes that no longer exist. Communities ravaged by the war on drugs. Watch investors grow rich from what once destroyed their lives. The green rush carries guilt in its perfume. But slowly, justice begins to stir. States pass expungement laws. Activists demand reparations. Former prisoners become entrepreneurs. The smoke finally carries more than escape. It carries memory, accountability, redemption. Would you have forgiven the world that punished you if it suddenly wanted your wisdom back? Culturally, the stigma dissolves. Mothers use CBD oil for insomnia. Grandfathers plant hemp beside tomatoes. Celebrities release wellness brands. Politicians who once shouted gateway drug now pose beside dispensaries. It's absurd. It's poetic. It's human. Even the plant itself seems to have evolved. Not stronger or weaker, just more understood. Farmers talk about soil, sunlight, and terpenes. The way monks once spoke of enlightenment. Cannabis has become not just a product, but a philosophy. A reminder that peace, healing, and curiosity were never crimes. Would you have seen it coming? That after 5,000 years of worship, fear, exile, and rebirth, A single green leaf would outlive every empire that tried to bury it? And maybe, tonight as you listen, you realize the story of cannabis isn't just about a plant. It's about us, our need to control what we don't understand, our talent for turning medicine into sin, and our endless hope that one day we'll learn. So take a breath. Look at how far we've come. From Siberian campfires to Silicon Valley dispensaries, from golden tombs to glass jars, from ritual smoke to scientific proof. The plant never changed, only we did. Would you have guessed that the most radical revolution wasn't political, religious, or technological, but botanical? Because in the end, humanity didn't conquer cannabis. It just grew alongside it. And every inhale of history is proof that sometimes the simplest things, a seed, a song, a shared breath, are the ones that survive us all.